right, everybody. Can I get some hands to let me know that I'm live and that people can hear me and that we're good? Great. Fantastic. That's like a hand. Ta-da is like a hand. Oh, those are hands. Great. Fantastic. All right. Here we go. I'm Aaron Inc. This is a talk about breaking down and reassembling the tile sets from Celeste so that we can learn more about them. So this is a visualization I made while I was applying for game dev jobs, but I was actually working on this stuff for a while beforehand, showing kind of the stages that the tile sets in Celeste are built from. So this is kind of like whet your appetite. This is what we're going for, right? Being able to build these things up piece by piece. So who am I? I'm Aaron P. Inc. I'm a software developer, game developer, video gamesy person, music, art person. I do a lot of different things. I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts, so I'm local. I'm also looking for jobs in game dev, so if you like this talk, come talk to me, whether you want to hire me or not. I would like to meet more people. I'm trans and genderqueer. My pronouns are they, them. And I own way too many Celeste shirts. I am a huge fan of this game. Bonk bonk as I set my thing down on the table. These are the new ones to replace the ones that got old and outdated when I put them through the wash too many times, because I wear them constantly, because I'm a huge fan. And so you might wonder, why are we copying Celeste? Why wouldn't we copy one of many, many pixel art games that are beautiful and gorgeous? And the answer is, I really like Celeste pixel art. I think it's gorgeous. I think Pedro Medeiros, the original artist, did an incredible job. But it's also just a really clever blend of procedural content, randomized content, and hand-placed content. And we'll go over why and how those things play in. It's also just super efficient. I was figuring out how to do tile sets like these for a procedural Metroidvania game that I'm working on. And we know that they must be efficient because they made over 1,000 levels in Celeste with only like one full-time pixel art person. So that tells us they must have been doing clever things to make this art style work for them, right? And which includes some automated tooling, which we'll talk about. So the other nice thing about these tile sets is that they're kind of approachable. There's some characteristic stuff about the style that just makes them a good starting point. So what are our goals? Our goals are to analyze Celeste tile sets, to visualize each step in the process as we go, to discuss the choices and motivations behind those choices that the team and like Pedro and XOK went through when they're building these things, and to extract some rules and design strategies so that we can do similar things ourselves. So let's talk first about the size and shape and resolution of our pixel art tile sets. So if we take this video, right, and we bring it into Aseprite as a still image, put a grid over it, we can adjust that grid until it lines up with the geometry, right? And if we do that, we can find that even if you rendered the game at like 1080p, it like when you can scale it down in Aseprite and have it look good as pixel art down to 320 by 180 pixels. So that's the resolution of our actual camera in-game. The tiles themselves are 8 by 8 pixels, which means a room, which is usually the size of one camera, is 40 by 22.5 tiles, 40 wide by 22.5 tall, right? So you might ask, why these numbers? These numbers might sound familiar to you if you've worked on pixel art before. They're kind of magic numbers because 320 by 180 is a 16 by 9 ratio, which upscales really nicely to 720p, 1080p, 1440p, all these nice HD resolutions that people are actually playing games in. Because it turns out, Steam does studies every year looking at what resolution people are actually playing games at, and by far 1080p is still the champ. Like 70% of players are playing at 1080p. Small tiles, so 8 by 8 tiles as opposed to 16 by 16 or larger tiles, have kind of a retro feel to them. And because these rooms are often levels unto themselves, it makes sense to have a fixed camera. It's very Super Metroid-like. So a thing to think about here is how the relative scale of the pixel art and the character and the level and the camera work together to influence how gameplay feels, right? So Celeste Classic, the game that Celeste was, an elaboration on, also had 8 by 8 pixel tiles, but look at how different the feel of those tiles is, not just in their visual design, but also just in the space they occupy in this like tiny cramped little window. Also notice that the character is exactly like one tile in size. This changes the way the game feels. And compare that against Super Metroid, right? So that has 16 by 16 tiles. It's actually slightly less wide than Celeste in terms of overall resolution, but also taller, which means it has kind of a similar amount of screen real estate, but it feels so much more cramped and so much more claustrophobic because the character is really big compared to the screen. The character's big compared to like the world that they're moving through. It kind of feels like you're going to bonk your head on stuff the entire time. And that was intentional. They designed this game specifically to make it feel like you're occupying a space that you're not quite well suited for. Makes platforming kind of hard. It makes speedrunning really interesting, really challenging. And Celeste was a game designed about movement and expression through movement. And so it makes sense that these levels are slightly more open, that we have more sort of geometry resolution to be able to make level elements out of. And so let's start by just visualizing the basic level geometry. This is what's sometimes called a gray box. In this case, we just have some solid shapes. We're going to call these solids, but they're really just representative of the terrain that you can walk around and jump on, right? We have some spikes that kill you if you jump on them, and we have a background color, which I've added here just to help you differentiate the background of this image from the background of the slides, and you'll see why in a little bit. This gives us just enough content to prototype. Like if you put a character in this level and let them jump around, it would play like a level, and you could probably make your way through it. And these are the easiest kinds of tiles to make. It's just one gray square and two spikes in a single square that get copied and pasted over and over again, and then rotated for the ones on the side. So if you had some on the ceiling, we could take the spikes and flip them vertically or rotate them 180 degrees. So next I'm going to say, okay, there's more than one kind of terrain in this level. And in Celeste, in this particular level, the terrain doesn't have any different mechanics, but it could. And identifying different kinds of terrain adds some color, it adds some visual interest to the game, and generally it makes these tilesets feel more interesting. So Celeste uses mixes and matches tilesets all over the place. It's a huge part of their visual design. So in this case, we're going to make 4 tilesets with 1 tile each in them. This brown dirt, the snowy blue rocks, the gray metal beams, and the green paving stones that are kind of hiding in the top right. And this increases visual interest. It makes the level more interesting. It has more stuff in it. And if we did have different mechanics, you could tell like which might be slippery or which might be climbable or which might burn you if you stepped on it based on the color. Lots of games stop here. You can make a totally functional game with really interesting mechanics with just this. But we can go further. So you might notice that this feels a little blocky and chunky and a little chaotic because all these colors are kind of like right next to each other. And if we look back at Celeste, we find that they don't actually fill out the entirety of the solids with color. They have kind of a dark interior area, right? And this is where we get into edge highlighting. It's a general tool to use contrast to kind of separate playable and non-playable spaces, right? So if you think about the 3D surface in this world that we're seeing a slice of, right? You can kind of imagine that the light is hitting the outside of that surface, illuminating it and showing it to us. That's the colored edge here. And that the light doesn't penetrate inside, so the insides are kind of dark. And this gives us kind of a little bit of sense of depth. It also just makes the level pop a lot more. It makes it super obvious where we can walk and where we can't. That line is really clear. And a really clever thing that the Celeste tilesets do is that they share a dark infill color. It's a flat color. And so the blue tile set with the blue rocks and snow on top of them from the start and the brown rock tile set actually clear to the same color, which means you can put them side by side and they just kind of like blend into each other. No big deal. It also hides the edges of the screen, right? Like my slides stop here and that kind of looks like it's just floating in a black void. Like that's part of the trick, that you're able to blend the spaces between screens and between cameras by having it clear to the solid color. But let's say we want more contrast, right? Let's say we want a 1 pixel border around the edge of all of these tiles. This is a thing that Metroid Fusion does a lot. They have like in many cases, just a literal 1 pixel line of red that is between the walkable area and kind of the background. And you know, in theory, this seems really straightforward, but in reality, we have to make a lot more tiles just to get this single pixel edge. We need straight edge tiles. We need external and internal corners. So when you have a hole punched out of the middle of a piece of terrain or you're turning around an external corner. We have single width tiles, like the metal beams are all single width tiles. So those need edges on more than one side, right? And then we have like combinations and rotations that maybe we can copy and paste tiles and rotate them, or maybe we can't because we want up and down tiles to look different. So instead of like 1 tile per tile set, now we need 10. So we went from having 4 tiles to having 40. And not only is this kind of challenging for people making pixel art for the first time, it's also challenging for level designers. Because if you make the level designers have to like mix and match all of these tiles to get them sort of situated, then it's going to be a lot more work to build out levels. Thankfully, there are tools for both the artists and the level designers to make this a lot easier. And this is where the like efficiency stuff starts to come in. So this is auto tiling. Auto tiling is a procedural tile placement system. It automatically selects the correct tile variant as you kind of paint tiles onto a grid. And it has rules based on looking at the surrounding tiles to see which things exist and which things don't exist. This is in Unity. I've built a bunch of my own custom auto tiling behaviors because I've been trying to replicate these tile sets, but you can make your own custom rules for most of these systems. It makes your level design much faster, and it also, so your level designer is happier because they can just make content. They don't need gray box assets anymore. They can just use your game assets and they'll automatically look right. You get a standardized template for your pixel artists, right? Where they know all the kinds of corners and edges and stuff, all those combinations that they need to build. They just have to make a customized version of each of those for each new tile set, which makes it a lot more manageable of a process. Like I said, you make custom rules to kind of make these tiles do whatever you want. And these systems are available in things like Unity, Game Maker Studio 2, Tiled, I believe, has this. Sprite is either adding it soon or has already added it. I think I saw a video about it being added after I made this slide. So really get familiar with these tools. If you're making pixel art, if you're making tile-based pixel art, you have to learn about auto tiling. It's so freaking useful. This is the scary slide, right? This is the slide where people go, oh no, we're moving on from like solid colors to actual details. And the first thing to keep in mind is like, don't panic. This isn't like rocket surgery. Pedro's really good at this, so he can make these things really fast. But fundamentally, these aren't that hard to make, especially if you have a good example to copy from, like Celeste. Thumbs up. So there are about 3 to 5 colors per tile set. There's a mid-tone. There's 1 to 2 bright colors. So that mid-tone is sort of the character color for the tile set. Like when you think about the snowy rock tiles, you think blue, right? So that's the mid-tone. There are 1 to 2 dark colors as well, and those help you do shadows and blend with the infill. And all of those coming together is a really, really tiny color palette, and that's super useful. If we have fewer colors, oh, people can't hear me now on Twitch. One moment, let me double check and make sure things are okay. Can people hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up again? Okay, well, it's just my partner telling me that things are broken. Thanks a lot, Alan. You're the best. I do love you. Thank you for warning me when things are not working. If we have fewer colors, we just have fewer choices to make for every position in this 8x8 tile, right? So, you know, these edge details, if you're following these kinds of rules, I didn't mention, they're impressionistic. These tiles are so small, there's no room for fine details. So if you want a rock, that's a blob of pixels. If you want paving stones, it's a bunch of rectangular pixels with a little bit of like darkness in between them. This is a thing that you can get to with experimentation and copying, you know, taking something, moving some pixels around, changing colors, seeing what you can make with it. It really just takes a little bit of playing with, but you can get to something that looks pretty cool quite quickly. And you might notice that, you know, I mentioned that these tile sets look really nice. This version doesn't look as nice. And the reason is because we have only 8x8 pixels per tile, if we put a bunch of tiles that are exactly the same in a row, we get this like repeating pattern that's kind of not pleasant to look at. It really reminds you that this is based on tiles. And Pedro and EXOK have a solution for that too. And that is to randomize the tiles we're actually displaying when we place them. So instead of having 1 of every edge tile, we have like 4-ish variants, and they're selected at random by the auto tiling system. And this dramatically reduces that visual repetition. It makes it, it's pretty easy to make more tiles. If you've made 1, you can copy and paste the tile, shift the pixels over a little bit, move some of them down, move some of them up, change a couple colors. And it's quite easy to make these variants. So making 4 is certainly not 4 times as hard as making 1, right? And this doesn't make more work for the level designer. The auto tiling system still does all this for you for free. And we get this kind of combinatorial efficiency that starts. So if you imagine we took 2 edge tiles and put them side by side, that would make like a 16 by 8 tile. And if we do that, and we have 4 variants of each one, that's 4 squared, so 16 by 8 tiles. But we want 16 by 16 tiles. Like if we want a more detailed aesthetic, that's kind of what we would go to. So how do we do that? We also randomize the interior, the infill of those tiles. So if we add an extra tile to the border inside of the outside edge, and randomize it, we get a lot more nuance to the sort of 16 by 16 pixel squares of our tile set. So we still get the really fine detail of the 8 by 8 tile geometry, but we start to get more of this detail and visual interest of larger tiles, kind of the best of both worlds. So if you can make about 10 variants per tile set, and again, these look kind of intimidating, but they're just blobs. They're blobs and circles and rectangles. They use the dark colors from each tile set. The pixels on the edges are designed, like, you don't want the entirety of the infill tile variants to be filled. Some of them can be entirely empty, about 10 to 20% of the ones in Celeste are. But you want them generally to have some pixels that touch the edges, because when you put 2 tiles next to each other, having the same color at the right side of one tile and the left side of another means the visual shape will blend together and disguise some of this gridded vibe that we have going on. So if we had 2 edge tiles with 4 variants each and 2 infill random tiles with 10 variants each, now we have 1,600 16 by 16 tile equivalents from just 14 different tiles. That's super cool. That's really, really nice from an efficiency standpoint. It lets us make more tile sets and use them together instead of spending all of our time making one beautiful tile set. So now that our tiles are looking nice, we can start to think about other ways to disguise the grid. And a great way to do this is with some hand-placed foreground props. So these are sprites that are not included in a particular tile set. They sit on top of the solids layer, so they kind of occlude our view both of the solids and of the player. And in this case, they're always touching a solid. So the snow is on top of the metal beams, it's on top of the dirt, it's on top of the blue rocks. And same thing with the greenery, right? It's on top of the tiles. And this breaks up those straight lines from the tile sets. And they're usable with multiple tile sets, as you can see here. Sometimes, in this case, the snow, it blends in with the snowy rock tile set. It has some snowy stuff baked into it, but it contrasts with the dirt tile set. But they're the same blobs. And this is a really clever thing. It lets you reuse your props in different contexts to achieve different visual goals without having to make more stuff. These generally want to be small so that they don't hide the character when you walk past them. Like, you can occlude the character's feet. That's usually not such a big deal. But if you block the entire character from view, it might be hard for people to track where you're going. And it's important to keep these simple. Like, the snow is blobs of white pixels, like pure white, FFFFFF, right? And the green plants are just individual, like, mostly straight lines. You can get away with a lot at this scale because everything is so impressionistic, and people's brains will fill in the fine details for you. So now we have this foreground, we have these props. How do we add more depth to this scene? And one way to do this with, the way that Celeste handles this is to use background tiles. So you might notice that the background looks actually quite similar to the foreground, and in fact, it's the same auto tiling system, right? It's just with tiles that are designed slightly differently. So they're lower contrast, they don't really have any details, they're darker, they're less saturated, but it's the same logic, right? You're still making one big solid shape, and in this case, it's rendered behind the character, behind the solids in the foreground, and it's there for you to walk in front of and to give this kind of room a backing, right? Like a back wall for you to kind of like visualize the character being inside of. The edge shapes here are rounded, but there's lots of different kinds of backgrounds, and these get used in lots of different games. But there's no physical interaction with them, so you have a lot more freedom to kind of like make these weirder, more natural shapes because they don't impact the movement gameplay. And so these backgrounds are kind of boring by themselves, but then you can start to add in background props. So these are there to reinforce the narrative, they're there to reinforce the setting. They're larger than the foreground props because the character is going to walk in front of them, so you don't have to worry about hiding Madeline in this case. And generally they're placed on top of the background tiles, but they don't necessarily have to be, right? They have to be in front of them so that we can see them, But they don't have to be attached to something physical in the space. They can kind of be floating. So the posters, for example, are kind of attached to the background tiles, but they're not on top of any foreground geometry. The sort of like pillars and boxes and stuff are kind of vaguely attached to the geometry, but like you don't know quite where they're attached. It doesn't matter. People's brains will figure it out. Like if you put things in a somewhat reasonable place and it looks cool, looking cool is the point. This is here to look cool and tell a little bit more story about the space. One interesting thing here is that there are a few little hints of accent colors. So you get a little bit of red in that weird obelisk, like right above the character when you start in the bottom left. And the yellow sign is like really bright and catches your attention. Having just a couple pops of color in here can really add some character to these spaces. And then we come to like the big, scary, ridiculous part of painted backgrounds. And I'll skip to the last point here first. These are hard. This is where fine art and pixel art kind of blend. Like lots of pixel art is fine art, but particularly these painted backgrounds are like, you can go learn landscape portraiture and make your own, but it's probably the best use of your time, unless that's the skill you really want to develop. Hire a pro. And like, you could hire a pro for any part of this process, but knowing how these tile sets work will also help you work with a professional much more effectively. But I can give you a couple pointers on these. Oh no, my thing stopped. I will try again. I might have to skip some slides. Okay, we're good. They go behind the background tiles, behind all the props. They're kind of the last thing in the room. They have even bigger, more detailed objects. Sometimes they have parallax layers that will move, at different rates depending on how you move in front of them. The trees are closer to us than the mountains, which is closer to us than the city. And they have kind of like a medium brightness. You can get away with being a little bit more distracting here than you can with the background tiles, because it's kind of like a constant between rooms. You won't notice. After a while of moving through these spaces, you start to not notice the backgrounds quite as much. There's some atmospheric interference going on here too. Like Pedro is absolutely flexing on like, how do you make something appear kind of further back? Desaturating and adding just a little bit of blurriness can really help to sell that something's further away. And the last thing would be particles and motion. And again, this is tricky. The particle effects here are not done by hand. They're done by a simulation, like you would any other kind of particle or weather effect in a game. So there's subtle prop animations. So if you can see the kind of banners and stuff that are hanging from the top of the building or the top of the level sway back and forth slightly. The plants wiggle a little bit in the wind. And you only need to change a couple pixels at a time to get some visual interest and motion in there. It just livens up the space a little bit. The particle system is just using white and blue pixels, single pixels. They move across the screen from the right to the left. They have some initial velocity. They have a random gravity going up or going down that pulls them in kind of like sweeping arcs instead of moving straight left or right. The harder they're blowing, the less that they'll go up or down because they have less time to be affected by gravity and they're zipping across the space. And you also have particles in the background, a separate particle system that's using gray instead of white. There's that atmospheric interference again, right? Blurring and desaturating stuff. I guess technically that's brightness and not saturation. But it makes them look further away. And they're also slower to give the impression that even though they're the same size, they're still 1 pixel because 1 pixel is the smallest you can go. But it makes them kind of appear like they're moving a little bit more slowly. And just to wrap up, like we've done it. We're at the end. Here are some custom tile sets that I've been working on for my procedural Metroidvania game, which will probably never be done. But if you want to hear more about, I'm doing a talk tomorrow at a time. I'll look that up when we move on to a Q&A here in a second, where I'm using tile sets like these. And you'll see I haven't done the painted backgrounds. I haven't done animations. I haven't done background or foreground props very much, because you can stop at any point in this process, take the learnings as works for you, and kind of play with it. And you don't have to do all of it at once, especially if you're using auto tiling systems. You can change your mind about how these tile sets work. That's how I made the visualizations for this talk. I was able, because I built all these auto tiling systems, to just slot in stuff and play with it in Unity, right? And that makes a huge difference to how comfortable you feel iterating on things, trying out new stuff, doing things you might be less comfortable with. Here's some references. The most important one is probably the one at the top. So I have a article version of this talk, I guess, on my blog /website/thing. And that'll have similar links. go through all this stuff. Has the same visualizations, though a couple of them I had to make minutes ago for this talk. You can check that out. And, you know, I can provide more references for this if you want to hang out and chat about it. I guess I'll be outside this room afterwards if people want to chat. And so, yeah, that's the thing. I will switch over, put my headphones on, and meet y'all in Gather.